Testing, testing.
Good afternoon, everybody. Here we are at the Sports Card Expo. I am so honored to be with Sean Mitten, a hockey author. You've got a new book coming out. We'll talk about that in a few seconds. We go way back. We've done a lot of things together, so I'm really privileged to be here. I've had an incredible journey in ice hockey, or hockey as we know it here. I'm now the head coach of the Melbourne Ice in Australia. You and I have talked many times about it. So just to be here sitting on a stage in Toronto at the Sports Card Expo with you is absolutely fantastic. Talk to us a little bit about, obviously, yourself, being an author, hockey author, and writing some incredible books, and also giving us an understanding of the game before and, of course, today.
Sure. First of all, Kerry, it's great to see you again. And, I think we all have interesting journeys in sports and hockey. And so for you, playing hockey at all different levels and now being a coach and being in Australia, I mean, how cool is that to be on that journey? And for me, I have a little bit different journey. I grew up in Georgetown, Ontario, which if everybody knows where that is, grew up playing hockey and baseball. And, one thing would lead to another, and I ended up in North Carolina. And as part of that journey, I was introduced to one of the famous hockey legends of Canada's time, and that is Paul Henderson. And hopefully, everybody recalls the amazing goal that Paul Henderson had in 1972. So I ended up, inviting him to North Carolina, and he spoke to a group of people, and they shared where they were when he had that amazing goal. And, we golfed. I golfed with Paul after that, and at age 67, I swear, he parred 7 of the last 9 holes. He's still in great shape, and all hockey players.
He lives on a golf course, don't forget.
Yeah, well, you know the forearms and the swings that hockey players have. But anyways, with Paul, unfortunately, 3 months after that golf outing, he was diagnosed with cancer. And, I thought, wouldn't it be terrible if people didn't have an opportunity to share their stories about where they were when Paul scored that magical goal in 1972? And so I ended up creating a book called The Goal That United Canada for the 40th anniversary. So that was kind of my first entree into the 72 series and how impactful it was, not only for Canadian hockey, but hockey in general, because really it changed hockey. We got to understand the Russians and how good they were.
The Cold War.
Cold War.
I see an audience here that most of them weren't born when the goal was scored, but obviously it's a history and a very important history, and also led into a lot of the NHL players that are here today.
You're exactly right. I mean, if we look at the NHL games last night, how many teams had Russian goalies in net? And, probably 10 of the top 15 goalies are probably Russian. But really, the genesis came back, you're looking back to 1972, which we'll talk a little bit about. And the legendary goalie Vladislav Tretiak, who we'll also talk about, was a big part of that. But, when we did our last podcast, we talked about the 50th anniversary.
Yes. 50 years, can you believe it? Obviously, very important. It was at the Bottom Line, where we sat. I do a podcast called Gooch Live on the Hockey News, and obviously with Paul Rosen, we interview a lot of people about the game. And that particular event was extra special. Of course, we had just lost a couple of players from that series. One of my very dear friends who we lost this year, Ron Ellis, and I had some great discussions about Peter Mahovlich and Frank Mahovlich in the hotel eating peanut butter in Moscow, and the Russians had stolen all their Molson Canadian, so they were actually drinking milk and eating peanut butter and jelly sandwiches after the victory.
Now, anybody who has their beer and their meat stolen will definitely get ticked off, and that'll motivate you, right?
Yeah, no question.
But anyways, that led to a 50th anniversary book, which I did on Gooch's live podcast, and that was called When Canada Shut Down. And what was interesting about that was we had both a Canadian and a Soviet perspective, so we got interviews from both sides. And, when you're writing a book, you have an outline of what you think you want in there. And at times, there are certain stories that get pushed off at the end. And so one of those stories was about Tretiak. And, it was really interesting that when you look back at Russian hockey, one of the things that the Canadian scouts said was the Russian goalies had a bad glove hand. And, Gooch, if you remember back then, Russian hockey sticks were terrible.
Oh, no question.
They were awful. And so if you think about being a goalie in a Russian hockey practice, you're not going to get the hard shots like a Bobby Hall shot or a Bobby Hall or a Frank Mahovlich. And so what would happen is, because you're not getting those great shots, your glove hand is getting neglected because the sticks are so bad. And so one of the stories that I heard back then was that the Russians, leading up to the games against Team Canada, they made a hockey shooting machine to practice on Tretiak's glove hand.
Well, another part of the story, sitting with Ron Ellis and hearing and finding out, Canada did send a scouting team to Moscow to check out Tretiak, to find out what type of goalie he was. And little did anybody know, his stag was the night before the game. So when the scouts got to see him, Mr. Tretiak had a couple of pops at night earlier and didn't have the greatest game. So when the scouting team came back, said, "Oh, we've got this goaltender." And obviously we know what he did against not only Team Canada, but of course in his illustrious career.
That might have been one of the best sandbagging stories in hockey history. And of course, everybody thought Tretiak was like a junior B goalie, and he ended up being incredible and being legendary after that. But one of the other stories that came about in my research, and for a lot of you, when you think about the self-improvement industry, we all want to get better at whatever field we're in, whether it's a hockey player, whether it's business or a coach. And one of the things that I learned about was that in 1970, not only did Tretiak, he went on to get his undergraduate degree, which is kind of rare for hockey players back at that time.
Absolutely.
But he was influenced by his mother, who was a phys ed coach in Russia. And so not only did he get his undergraduate degree in physical education, but he went on to get his master's degree, and he did this paper, what was called, in some ways, How to Be the Best Goalie That You Could Be.
Yeah.
So could you imagine that? A hockey player back in the 70s doing something like that?
Well, today all you do is turn on your cell phone and you learn everything, whether to be a goal scorer or a good goaltender. Yes, he was a very I was blessed to have the opportunity to meet him a couple of times in some of the events. I was over in Moscow, believe it or not, in the Red Square. A guy named Scott McPherson, along with Phil Esposito, had a bunch of guys go over, and because I played in Europe, they'd asked me to participate. So I was actually playing on the Red Square, and we went to Lizhnitsky Arena, and I'll tell you what, I only saw it as a young kid. Remember the rabbit ears and the black and white TV, and I walked into this arena, and I was in awe, realizing this is where Paul Henderson scored that goal with only seconds to go to win it. And a lot of people don't realize that that was the first of its kind, and then when the Americans won it in 1980, they made a movie over it, for God's sakes.
Right.
They win one trophy, and they make a movie.
It must have been an amazing feeling being at that place of history that we all witnessed, even when we look at black and white and other videos. But, what was really amazing about the Tretiak story was how he looked at being a goalie. And he looked at it from a very holistic perspective. He didn't just think about it. His first was about goal setting. He talked about, my goal was to be a goalie for the Russian national team. And then he talked about, well, who are my idols, or who do I look at who are other great goalies? And he looked at the NHL. He looked at people like Jacques Plante. He looked at people like Crozier. And so there were so many goalies that he studied to find out how to be more effective. He also thought about, what did he need to do from an equipment standpoint? How did he need to be better at his angles? And so in addition to that, and this is before the self-help industry was back in 1970s.
And again, so importantly, these were books. Today you just click online and you have everything, and it's instant.
Right. So he talked about the emotional intelligence aspect of, when things go wrong, and especially if you're a goalie, you have to be mentally strong, right? And he had the emotional intelligence to say, how do I react if I let a goal in? And of course, he let two of the biggest goals in hockey history, in the Olympics in 1980, and of course the Paul Henderson goal. But he basically put together 50 or 60 pages of incredible information about how he would be the best goalie that he could be. And when you think about that, Carrie, how many people have done a paper on their career? How many you can think of?
Maybe 3 in a lifetime, if that.
That's exactly right. And so one of the reasons why this story didn't get published when Canada shut down was because we had so many stories about Tretiak that we didn't want it to overload the book.
Right.
it would be an imbalance about, Tretiak versus the whole series. So, 2 years after, I thought, this is such an important story for people to be mindful about how to be more effective in whatever's important to them. And that was really the inspiration for the Student of the Game Mindset book that's coming out in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, of course. And the game has evolved since then, and these mental aspects of the game have become so much bigger. So the book that you're writing right now, tell us why it's so important that our youth today read books like this to understand their place in whatever sport they're doing.
I think one of the things is we have so much more access to our heroes than we ever did. I mean, back in the day, if we wanted to watch a game, we got Hockey Night in Canada and maybe a game on Wednesday, and then we might get the box scores, right? But there was no replays.
The other night, did we not watch 18 games every team or so? No, 32, carry the one. I didn't get to school very good, but there were an incredible amounts of games, all where you could watch it on your phone, your iPad, your computer, or your television.
Right. And kids are learning some amazing things these days. From a skill standpoint, there's no limits. They're learning things like the Michigan, which, nobody even thought about back in the day. But it's broader than that, though. We need to understand how to receive feedback. It's not easy to hear from a coach constructive criticism that helps us get better. It's not easy to think about adversity. So if you're not feeling good, people get depression these days. How to seek help if we get head injuries, and maybe we can talk in a second about stop concussion. How do you get support and the resources that you need to be the best that you can be? So maybe you can talk a little bit about what your feedback on stop concussions.
Before we get into that, I'd like to obviously student of the game mindset. As we grow, whether it be in sport, in business, or in life, and we're trying to teach our younger players or athletes to become better people, in this day and age of the participation medal, how hard is it with the youth to understand that you want to better yourself every day? It's not about beating the other person. It's about being better yourself, because it's not only as an athlete important, but also as a father or mother in the future, or a leader of our country. Talk to me a little bit about that dynamic, because it's got to be really difficult if I'm in participating in a sport and we come in first, we get a medal, and if we come in last, we get a medal. So the meaning is a lot different.
Right. So, I think first of all is the awareness of, for us to get better on a regular basis, first of all, to be aware of what our strengths and weaknesses are, right? And so, first of all, there's a mindfulness in that to say, what are areas that we can improve? How can we work with our coaches? For our coaches to help us get better. And I think the other part that you're alluding to is, how do we transfer this to life after sport too? So that, to your point, we become better humans, we help others, and it's not just about being the best hockey player, but how can we be better in whatever field of endeavor we choose afterwards.
So I'm now the head coach of the Melbourne Ice in their pro league from March to August, and then when I come back, I donate my time to an organization called the King Heights Academy U18. One of my players is here, Nicholas Startsev, and one of the things that I realized when I went from the pro to obviously working with youth, another one all the way from Spain, Roman and Liam Fraser. One of the things that I noticed was the difference between being with pros and being with these youth. My role as an assistant coach is not to get the wins and losses. That's not. What I am there to is to obviously progress their skill development, make sure they fall in love with the game, make sure they have fun, but more importantly, understand the sport is only a game, and there's more to the game than just being a sport. It is the learning experiences. We say, oh, you get the intangibles. The intangibles are working together in a team. And I think student of the game mindset probably addresses that and says, listen, it's not an individual game. We see that. The last couple of weeks, Toronto Maple Leafs were suffering dearly, as we know, on the power play, and arguably the best goal scorer of our time right now is missing a few games, and their power play goes 60%. Right. So it's now we understand it's more of a unit, it's more of a team than an individual. Love to hear your ideas on that.
Yeah, that's a great example. And by the way, the similar with when Connor McDavid went out, right?
Yes.
McDavid goes out, and of course the team starts getting better, and people joke, say, well, maybe the team's better without McDavid.
No,
which,
let's be realistic.
That's not gonna happen.
Or Austin Matthews, come on.
Or Austin Matthews, two of the greatest players. But to your point is, when we play as a unit and there's awareness of how we can make each other better, we all become so much more effective. And I think there's so much to learn and so much to be aware of. Sport is such a wonderful vehicle.
Yeah.
And I've talked to Paul Henderson, and he was very kind enough to write the foreword for the book for Student of the Mindset. And, one of the things that he shared with me, and I really like this, he still gets together from a leadership standpoint with other individuals, and he said, we don't always feel our best.
No.
And one of the things that's important that he still does to this day is he checks in with his friends to see how they're doing. And I thought, wow, somebody who's a legend in his time, he still takes the time to see how his people are doing from an emotional standpoint and how he can help them, and that's part of being a great teammate, right?
Well, I met Paul Henderson on several occasions with Ronnie Ellis, and one of the things that he taught me is just give a hug, because you just never know when somebody needs that. As we go on about the book, I just also want to say, because I'm coaching this international team, we've got players from Spain, from Russia, from Melbourne, Australia. It's also a new dynamic for these kids because the game has become global. When you and I played, or when we came up as a youth, there was only Canadians. There were no Americans or anybody from any other parts. So now you have a different mindset, very similar to your book, where there's a different culture, there's a different language, there's a different meaning of the game. How do you address that in Student of the Game mindset?
Yeah, I think one of the phrases or terms that I use is called diversity in thinking. And so if you think about it, first of all, from a brain standpoint, we all think differently. Some people are very linear in nature, some process very differently. But ultimately, we all have different experiences. We have different knowledge bases. We come from different countries. And so in doing so, there's a great opportunity to share what we know with others. And what I suggest in the concept of diversity in thinking is if we collaborate and we put our heads together, we're able to share ideas and concepts that maybe we wouldn't have learned otherwise. And Carrie, when you think about all the experiences that you've had as a pro and all the different people that you've learned from, we can't do it alone, right? And if we have that mindset of it's not just about us, it's doing as a team and we can't do it alone, we'll all be much more ahead.
Well, no question. I went over to Europe at a young age. I was not the greatest student. I passed grade 12 by passing grade 6 twice. So I was able to travel over to Europe and become worldly educated. I was there the day the Berlin Wall fell. So the sport gives you more than just the game. And I think when you address it in Student of the Game mindset, it's so important that everybody that participates, whether it's the player, the coach, the general manager, the administration of the team, the parents, it's so important that we all understand why we're there and why we're there at this moment.
One of the things I want to ask you is, when you think about all the different locations some of your players are from, sport, and in this case hockey, is such a great connector.
Yeah.
Like, would they be able to have those types of conversations being from different countries? Because hockey is something that it unifies them. I wonder what your perspective is like when they have different life experiences.
The only
come
difference
together.
is it becomes a language barrier only, I think. Ice hockey, as it's known outside of Canada, the reason hockey is known as field hockey for us, the differences are very, very minuscule. The game is the game. We know back in the old days it was, the Cold War versus us. Now today it's a very global game, and it's no more, look at the Russians, they come as a 5-man unit. It's really diverse now. And I think that's the difference between then and now. And of course, the internet has changed it completely. And you watch the game, watch Connor McDavid, Cale Makar, these players, the way they can skate, the game is so more developed. Everything's faster, they're bigger, stronger. We always hear that. You know what? It's true. And so I think that's what's great when you get this global game and you get people from all different countries with different mindsets, different ideas, the game can only be better. Because if we only stick in that one lane and we don't see the diversity of the game, for when the Russians came back in 1972. I know we're going to talk about the Treacy story in a minute. Think about it. we as athletes in those days would come into training camp with a big fat beer belly and get in shape. Today, it's 12 months a year. So when Team Canada 72 showed up to training camp, none of them were prepared for what they were going to experience. Not one of them. They all said, we stopped smoking and drinking the day before we got to camp, and then we used camp to get in shape, whereas the Russians were already in mid-form because they practiced 11 months together as one unit, living together. So things have really changed since then.
You're totally right. And, back then, when they saw Tretiak bouncing a tennis ball off the wall, they thought he was crazy. They said, what is this guy doing? But really, there was an eye-opener to say, to your point, that training has become year-round, but not just that, but cross-training. Because back then, the Russians played a lot of soccer. They did a lot of basketball. But the other interesting thing that I learned in my research was they also played a lot of chess. And so they were using their minds to think strategically about playing the next move forward. And that was really interesting to me, how they not only did it physically, but also mentally and intellectually.
Hey, listen, talking politics when you talk about chess, just imagine Putin and Trump having a chess game today. Hey, listen, let's talk about Tretiak, the untold story. We still never had the opportunity to see him play in the National Hockey League. Some outside the game think he could have been one of the best ever. Obviously, we won't know that because of the fact that he wasn't able to perform in North America outside of, obviously, the global game. Man, he had some incredible stats that just show that he is a goaltender that would have dominated, as did Hasek in the National Hockey League. I think he would have dominated.
We didn't nickname you the Dominator. We just call you Gooch.
I said dominate. No, but so talk to us about the untold story, because a lot of people are still mystified by this word Tretiak because they didn't get to see him mainstream. They only got to see him maybe in the Olympics, sometimes in the World Championships, but we really didn't get to know him until he came over to North America and became a coach or a goalie coach for the Chicago Blackhawks.
Yeah, not everybody knows the story that in 1984, the Montreal Canadiens drafted Tretiak. And so what's really funny about that is if you think in the final Game 8, it was Ken Dryden on one end of the rink and Tretiak on the other, so Montreal versus the Russians. And that year in 1984, not only did the Montreal Canadiens draft Tretiak in the later rounds, they also drafted Patrick Roy, which was probably not a bad pick, and they also drafted Sidney Crosby's dad.
Okay.
And Sidney Crosby's dad was a goalie back then. So at that time, 1984, there was an Olympics in Russia.
Yeah.
And so that was Tretiak's final gold medal that he won during the Olympics. What also happened in parallel during that time is Serge Savard met with the Russian Hockey Federation because he was asking for permission for Tretiak to come and play for the Montreal Canadiens. Now, what happened next was they did not grant him his release. And after Tretiak won the gold medal, he went on to retire.
That's right.
And so instead of staying in Russia, he had an opportunity to come to North America, and he started coaching goalie schools. He was famous for teaching in Canada and also in the United States. People who I interviewed in Minnesota loved Tretiak. And for him, it was a break because he was a legend in Russia. Not everybody knew him walking through the streets of Canada and Russia. But the other thing was he became, to your point, he became the goalie coach of a Hockey Hall of Famer named Ed Balfour.
That's right.
And Ed Balfour is going to be here this weekend signing autographs. I interviewed him for the book as well. And one of the things that was fascinating was I asked Ed about his relationship with Tretiak. And you could see that his energy level went through the roof, the smile on his face, and he said, "My brother."
Yeah.
And so when you think about somebody who was a goalie for the Russians during the Cold War, and somebody who really embraced themselves in North America, and with people like Ed Balfour, he was a great ambassador for the sport, and he taught so many goalies in North America how to be more effective and basically have a student of the game. And it's unfortunate he never got to play in the NHL because that would have been a wonderful story.
So just before we wrap up and we discuss what principles or lessons have been learned through the time of the Tretiak, I want to ask you this question. Just think, if Tretiak had been an NHL goaltender, We had Bobby Orr changing the way the defensive played. We had Gretzky changing the way forwards played. Yes, we had goaltenders like Hasek, the Dominator, the way he played. But before that time, Tretiak, I guarantee you, would have changed the way most goaltenders played at an earlier state because he was non-conventional, yet very, very stoic.
And he was also, you have to remember, he was very tall for his time back then. He was over 6 feet tall.
Him and Kenny Dryden standing together.
Yeah, they were both rare goalies. And so I guess the other side of it is Tretiak was ultra fit. I mean, he was just a tremendous athlete. Back then, goalies weren't known for being great athletes. So he, to your point, he would have been really switched the mindset and the preparation of how goalies were in the NHL.
No question. All right. As we get close to the end, obviously the author, Sean Mitten, wrote the book, Student of the Game Mindset. What lessons have we learned? Obviously through the Tretiak untold story, but also the fact of the international game growing the way it is, and we having to look at the sport, hockey, and other sports differently because there is this incredible global influence.
You know, I think one of a couple of things that I teach in the book is first of all, you know, the more preparation that you have, the more confidence that you will drive. The more confident you are, the more success you'll have. But I think also when we think about we can't do it alone, so we want to work with our teammates, we want to work with our coaches, but we also want to be resourceful. We want to identify opportunities for improvement. And you mentioned earlier about how the internet has changed everything from a sports standpoint. We have great opportunities to ask the right questions for us to be more effective. And the great thing is once we identify these things as athletes, as hockey players, or other sports, we can then transfer that to other areas of our life. We can transfer it to our kids, our grandkids, to other employees, and it becomes a way of life. And that's really what I want to share with people in the book is it's not just limited to hockey players, but it's to whatever is important to you in your field of endeavor. And I think if we have that mindset and we're resourceful, then we'll all have a level of success that we can enjoy and have a great life.
Well, the principles in hockey apply to all of it, whether it be an occupation, whether it's our life, the principles that I learned with teamwork, the camaraderie, the having a goal and building towards that goal and how to achieve that goal, so vastly important. So my last question is to you, how do we learn more? I know we buy the book and understand it, but you're more than just writing a book. You're more than an author. So if I'm out there and I want my young boy or girl or my teenager to be better, not only at the game, but thinking the game, how do they go about that?
Yeah, Kerry, I'm doing something a little different this time, and I really want to get this message out to as many people as possible. I'm actually not going to sell the book. I'm going to make it complimentary or free from a digital perspective. And if some of the listeners out there on the podcast are interested, they can just send an email to me at Sean, S-E-A-N, at SOG, which stands for Student of the Game, so SOGmindset.com. And, you know, for me, I want to get this out to as many people as possible because I think it's a really important story. And, you know, I think we can all help each other through this process. So I also want to say, you know, I know you do a lot for your kids. And I really wish you all the best in the Australian League and the great experience and wonderful experience as an ambassador you've had over there as well.
Hey, listen, who said good things aren't for free? Thank you for not only sharing your story, thank you for sharing with us an incredible book, an incredible journey that I think all of us can learn from. Sean Mitten, you are one of the best. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak with you for a few minutes.
Always great to see you, Gooch.
Student of the Game Mindset. Check it out. What a great question. I'll allude to a different story that comes back to it, if you don't mind. I had the opportunity, I played in Germany at an older age and had an opportunity to play against a reunion team from Team Soviet. And so they had a bunch of the players come. I can't remember all the names, but the defenseman with the big mitts, we got an opportunity to sit together. He brought a bottle of vodka, put it on the table, and said, I want to tell you a story. And he told me the story about how that moment demoralized the club. They had never seen anything like it. And he said, we as Russians, we only wanted to beat the best at the best, and that the Canadians had to take one of our best players out by a dirty play. And it was a dirty play. Bobby, there was no reason for that. And that's what we try and teach now. It's actually a teaching moment. Some people think it's a negative, but it's also a teaching moment to say to these young men and women that are playing the game today, listen, if you're going to be the best you are, whether you be Connor McDavid or you're a third-line player or you only play beer league hockey, you've got to better yourself. And when you play against the best, beat them at their best. Don't beat them because you injure them. And so I think it's really important to understand that could have been a very defining moment. But also, don't forget Bobby Orr was at that time, had a knee injury, and Bobby Hull was not able to play because of the WHA. So I think there were negatives at that time that played a role. And, Bobby Clarke was a great man, but that was a bad I think it was a defining, for sure. Great job. Well done. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.